Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he crouched behind the fallen log, his rifle steady in his hands. The morning mist clung to the dense forest around him, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the soft rustling of leaves that meant his prey was near. He had been tracking the elk for 3 days now, following its path through the rugged mountains of Montana. This hunt would feed his family for months, and the money from selling the hide would help pay for his younger sister's medical bills. At 28, Marcus had spent most of his adult life in these mountains. His father had taught him to hunt when he was barely 10 years old, and now it was more than just a skill, it was his livelihood. He lived in a small cabin he had built with his own hands, miles away from the nearest town. Most people thought he was crazy for choosing such an isolated life, but Marcus found peace in the wilderness that he had never found among crowds of people. The elk emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees, its magnificent antlers catching the early morning sunlight. Marcus held his breath and aimed carefully. One clean shot would do it. His finger was just starting to apply pressure to the trigger when he heard voices coming from behind him. Well, what do we have here? The voice was rough and carried a tone that made Marcus's blood run cold. He slowly turned his head to see 3 men standing about 20 feet away. They were dressed in camouflage, but something about them seemed off. Their clothes were too clean, too new, and they carried themselves like men who were used to getting their way through intimidation rather than skill. The largest of the 3, a man with graying hair and cold blue eyes, stepped forward. "You must be the hermit everyone in town talks about, Marcus, isn't it?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm Frank Garrison, and these are my associates, Pete and Danny." Marcus lowered his rifle but kept it ready. He had heard the name Garrison before. Frank Garrison owned half the businesses in the valley below and had a reputation for being ruthless in his dealings. What he was doing up here in the mountains was anyone's guess, but Marcus doubted it was anything good. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the tension he felt building in his chest. Frank's smile widened, straight to the point. "I like that." He gestured toward the elk, which had disappeared back into the trees at the sound of their voices. "Sorry about scaring off your breakfast there, son, but I think what I have to offer you might be worth a lot more than one elk." Marcus said nothing, waiting for the man to continue. "You see, I've been watching you for a while now. You're quite the hunter, living up here all alone, taking care of yourself. That takes a special kind of man." Frank paused and looked around at the wilderness surrounding them. "But I'm wondering if you might be getting a little lonely up here." "I'm fine," Marcus replied curtly. Frank chuckled. "Oh, I'm sure you think you are. But here's the thing, son. I have 3 daughters, and they're all of marriageable age. Beautiful girls, every one of them. Smart too, and they could use a husband who knows how to provide for a family." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I'm not looking for a wife." Now, don't be so hasty," Frank said, raising his hand. "You haven't even heard my offer yet." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. "This is Sarah, my eldest. She's 25, knows how to cook and keep house. She'd make any man proud." Marcus glanced at the photo but didn't take it. Sarah was indeed beautiful, with long blonde hair and blue eyes like her father's. But there was something about the way Frank spoke about her that made Marcus uncomfortable. "Then there's Emma," Frank continued, producing another photograph. "She's 23 and has a college education. Very refined, very proper. She could help you improve your situation up here." Again, Marcus didn't take the photo. "And finally, there's little Katie," Frank said, his voice taking on an almost paternal tone. "She's 21 and sweet as pie. Hasn't been spoiled by too much education or fancy ideas. She'd be grateful to have a strong man to take care of her." Marcus felt his anger beginning to build. "Mr. Garrison, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in marrying any of your daughters. I like my life the way it is." Frank's expression darkened. "I don't think you understand the situation, son." He nodded to his 2 companions, who stepped closer to Marcus. Pete was almost as large as Frank, with arms like tree trunks and scars on his knuckles that spoke of many fights. Danny was smaller but had the lean, dangerous look of a man who was quick with a knife. "You see," Frank continued, "my daughters need husbands, and you need a wife. It's a simple arrangement that benefits everyone involved." "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Frank's smile disappeared entirely. "Then I'm afraid you might find life up here in these mountains becoming very difficult. Hunting accidents happen all the time up here. Men disappear and are never found. It would be a real shame if something like that happened to such a skilled hunter as yourself." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus felt his grip tighten on his rifle, but he was outnumbered, and these men had the look of people who were comfortable with violence. More importantly, they clearly knew where he lived and had been watching him. Even if he got away from them today, they could come back any time. "Of course," Frank continued, his voice becoming conversational again, if you were to marry one of my daughters, you'd become family, and I'd take care of my family. You'd never want for anything again. I'd set you up with a nice house in town, maybe even find you some work that doesn't require you to live like a savage up here in the woods. Marcus felt trapped. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to take care of himself without relying on anyone else. The thought of being forced into marriage, of having his life controlled by a man like Frank Garrison, was almost unbearable. How do I know you won't just kill me after I marry one of your daughters? Marcus asked. Frank laughed. Because then I'd have to deal with a grieving daughter, and trust me, that's not something any father wants. No, son. Marry one of my girls and treat her right, and you'll live a long and comfortable life. Marcus looked at the three men surrounding him. Pete and Danny had their hands resting on the butts of their pistols, making it clear that running wasn't really an option. Frank stood there with his photographs, waiting patiently for an answer. The forest around them was silent except for the sound of wind moving through the pine branches. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, and Marcus found himself wondering if this would be the last time he heard such sounds as a free man. I need time to think about it, Marcus said finally. Frank shook his head. I'm afraid that's not how this works, son. You choose now, or my boys here will save me the trouble of having to arrange a wedding. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct told him to fight, to take his chances against these three men rather than submit to their demands. But he also knew that even if he somehow managed to escape today, they would just come back. Frank Garrison was not the type of man to let something like this go. What happens if I choose one of your daughters and she doesn't want to marry me? Marcus asked, trying to buy time to think. Oh, don't worry about that, Frank said with another cold smile. My daughters are very obedient. They'll marry whoever I tell them to marry. The casual way Frank spoke about his daughters, as if they were property to be traded rather than people with their own thoughts and feelings, made Marcus's stomach turn. He began to wonder what kind of life these women were living, and what kind of man would use his own children as bargaining chips in whatever game he was playing. So what's it going to be, son? Frank asked, checking his watch. We don't have all day. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think through his options. He could feel the weight of the three men's stares, could sense their growing impatience. When he opened his eyes again, he had made his decision. I want to meet them first, he said quietly. Frank raised an eyebrow. Meet them? Your daughters. If I'm going to marry one of them, I want to meet all three and let them know what's happening. I won't be part of forcing someone into marriage who doesn't know what's going on. Pete snorted. You're not exactly in a position to make demands here, Mountain Man, but Frank held up a hand to silence him. No, I think that's reasonable. Shows character. He studied Marcus with those cold blue eyes. Very well. We'll go down to my house, you'll meet the girls, and you can make your choice. But understand this. You will choose one of them today, and you will marry her within the week. Are we clear? Marcus nodded. Clear. The walk down the mountain took nearly 2 hours. Frank and his men had horses waiting at the base of the trail, and they gave Marcus one to ride. As they made their way toward town, Marcus tried to form some kind of plan. He had always been a man of action, someone who solved problems directly, but this situation called for more subtlety than he was used to. Frank's house sat on a hill overlooking the town, a massive Victorian mansion that spoke of wealth and power. As they approached, Marcus could see movement behind the lace curtains in several windows. Word of their arrival was clearly spreading through the household. They were met at the front door by an elderly woman in a black dress, who looked at Marcus with obvious disapproval. Mr. Garrison, she said stiffly, the young ladies are waiting in the drawing room as you requested. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, Frank replied. He turned to Marcus. Now, remember what we discussed. You're here to choose a bride, not to make friends. The drawing room was decorated in rich burgundy and gold, with heavy furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable. 3 young women sat on a long sofa, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes downcast. They were all beautiful, just as Frank had said, but Marcus could see the tension in their postures, the fear in their eyes. Girls, Frank said, his voice taking on the tone of a man addressing his possessions rather than his children. This is Marcus. He's a hunter who lives up in the mountains, and he's looking for a wife. Sarah, the eldest, looked up first. She had her father's blue eyes, but where his were cold and calculating, hers were filled with a sadness that made Marcus's heart ache. Hello, she said softly. Emma, the middle daughter, appeared more defiant. Her jaw was set in a way that reminded Marcus of her father, but her defiance seemed to come from desperation rather than cruelty. A hunter? She said, looking Marcus up and down. I suppose that's better than the last man father tried to marry me off to. Katie, the youngest, said nothing at all. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands and seemed to be trying to make herself as small as possible. Frank's voice carried a warning. "Emma, mind your manners." "It's all right," Marcus said, speaking directly to the women for the first time. "She has a right to speak her mind." He looked at each of them in turn. "I want you all to know that I'm not here by choice. Your father has made me an offer I can't refuse, but I want you to understand that I would never force any woman into marriage if I had any other option." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. It was clear that no one had ever spoken to them so directly about their father's business arrangements before. Frank stepped forward. "That's enough of that. Marcus, you need to make your choice." But Marcus wasn't finished. He sat down in a chair across from the sofa, positioning himself so that he was at eye level with the three women. "I want to know what you think about this. All of you." "What we think doesn't matter," Emma said bitterly. "It never has." "It matters to me," Marcus replied. He looked at Sarah. "What do you want to do with your life?" Sarah glanced nervously at her father before answering. I like to read. I help Mrs. Henderson with the household accounts sometimes. I'm good with numbers." Marcus nodded. "And you, Emma?" "I wanted to be a teacher," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "I finished college, but father says teaching isn't suitable for a woman of my station." She looked directly at Marcus. "I suppose living in a cabin in the mountains isn't suitable either, but it might be better than living in a cage." Marcus felt a spark of admiration for her spirit. Even as he recognized the pain behind her words, he turned to Katie. "What about you?" Katie looked up for the first time, and Marcus saw that she had been crying. "I just want to be safe," she whispered. The simple, heartbreaking honesty of her answer hit Marcus harder than any of Frank's threats had. He suddenly understood that these women weren't just being used as bargaining chips in their father's games. They were prisoners in their own home, their lives controlled by a man who saw them as nothing more than assets to be traded. "Enough," Frank said sharply. "Marcus, make your choice, now." Marcus stood up slowly. He looked at each of the three women again, seeing not just their beauty but their fear, their sadness, their desperation. An idea was beginning to form in his mind, a plan that was risky and might get them all killed, but it was the only thing he could think of that might give any of them a chance at freedom. "I choose all three of them," he said quietly. The room fell silent. Frank stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "What did you say?" "I said I choose all three of them. I want to marry all three of your daughters." Pete and Danny moved closer, their hands going to their weapons, but Frank held up a hand to stop them. "That's not how this works, son. You choose one." Marcus shook his head. "You said you wanted them all married. You said you needed them to have husbands who could provide for them. Well, I can provide for 3 wives just as well as I can provide for one, and this way none of them has to face whatever you have planned for them alone." Emma was staring at him with something that might have been hope. Sarah looked confused but intrigued. Katie still seemed terrified, but there was something different in her expression now. "You can't marry 3 women," Frank said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Not legally, no," Marcus admitted. "But we're not talking about a legal marriage, are we? We're talking about an arrangement. You want your daughters provided for and protected. I'm offering to do that for all 3 of them." Frank's eyes narrowed. "And why would you do that? What's in it for you?" Marcus looked him straight in the eye. "Because I'm not the kind of man who leaves innocent people to suffer when I have the power to help them." The silence stretched out between them. Marcus could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the sound of his own heartbeat. He was gambling everything on his reading of Frank Garrison's character, betting that the man's need to appear reasonable and in control would override his desire for revenge. Finally, Frank spoke. "You're either very brave or very stupid, son." "Maybe both," Marcus replied. Frank walked over to the window and stood looking out at his property for a long moment. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. "Very well, you can take all 3 of them. But understand this, you're responsible for all of them now. If anything happens to any of my daughters, if any of them are unhappy or mistreated in any way, I'll hold you personally responsible. Do we understand each other?" Marcus nodded. "We understand each other." "Good." Frank turned to his daughters. "Girls, pack your things. You'll be leaving with Marcus tonight." Sarah stood up first. "Tonight?" "But you have 1 hour," Frank said curtly. "Don't pack anything you can't carry. Your new life starts now." As the 3 women hurried from the room, Emma paused at the door and looked back at Marcus. "Thank you," she said quietly. After they left, Frank turned back to Marcus. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" Marcus said nothing. "Let me give you some advice, son. Those girls have lived comfortable lives here. They're used to fine things, to having servants wait on them. Life in your little mountain cabin isn't going to be easy for them. They might not be as grateful as you think. That's their choice to make, Marcus replied. Frank smiled that cold smile again. We'll see. Henderson will provide you with supplies for the journey up the mountain. Don't make me regret this arrangement, Marcus. I'd hate to have to come looking for you. As Marcus waited for the women to pack, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. He had acted on instinct, trying to save 3 innocent women from an impossible situation, but he hadn't really thought through what would happen next. How was he going to provide for 3 people who had never lived in the wilderness? How was he going to protect them if Frank decided to change his mind about their arrangement? But as he heard the sounds of hurried packing from upstairs, he knew he had made the right choice. Whatever happened next, at least Sarah, Emma, and Katie would have a chance to choose their own futures. The journey up the mountain was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. He was used to traveling alone, moving quickly and quietly through the wilderness, but traveling with 3 women who had never spent a night outside of their comfortable mansion was an entirely different challenge. Sarah rode her horse with determination but obvious discomfort, wincing every time they hit a rough patch in the trail. Emma had wrapped herself in a heavy coat and kept asking questions about everything they passed, the names of trees, the types of rocks, the habits of various animals. Katie rode in silence, clutching her small bag of belongings and looking terrified every time a branch cracked or an owl hooted. By the time they reached Marcus's cabin, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The women dismounted stiffly and stood looking at the small log structure that would be their new home. It's so small, Sarah said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. It's perfect, Emma said firmly, shooting her sister a warning look. Thank you for bringing us here, Marcus. Katie said nothing, but Marcus noticed that she had stopped crying during the ride up the mountain. That was something, at least. The cabin had been built for one person, and Marcus suddenly realized he hadn't thought through the practical aspects of his impulsive decision. There was 1 bedroom, 1 bed, and nowhere near enough space for 4 people to live comfortably. You 3 can take the bedroom, he said, carrying their bags inside. I'll sleep out here by the fire. Emma looked around the cabin's main room, taking in the rough-hewn furniture, the stone fireplace, the shelves lined with hunting equipment and preserved food. This is really how you live? All alone up here? Marcus nodded. It's a good life. Peaceful. But don't you get lonely? Sarah asked. Marcus considered the question. He had always told himself that he preferred solitude, that he didn't need other people. But looking at these 3 women, seeing the way they instinctively moved closer together for comfort and support, he realized that maybe loneliness was something he had simply learned to ignore. Sometimes, he admitted, over the next few days they began to establish a routine. Marcus taught the women the basics of wilderness survival, how to identify edible plants, how to start a fire, how to preserve meat. Sarah turned out to have a natural talent for managing their limited supplies, carefully rationing their food, and keeping track of what they needed. Emma threw herself into learning everything she could about their new environment, asking endless questions and taking mental notes about everything Marcus taught her. Katie remained quiet but proved to be surprisingly good at the detailed work of food preparation and maintaining their equipment. But as the days passed, Marcus began to realize that their biggest challenge wasn't learning to survive in the wilderness, it was figuring out how to live together as a makeshift family. We can't keep going on like this, Emma said one evening as they sat around the fire. We need to talk about what's really happening here. Marcus looked up from the knife he was sharpening. What do you mean? I mean that we're not really married, Emma said bluntly. We're just 4 people sharing a cabin because we all got backed into a corner by my father. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Emma, maybe this isn't the time. No, this is exactly the time, Emma interrupted. We need to decide what we want our lives to look like. Are we going to pretend to be Marcus's wives forever? Are we going to try to build real relationships? Are we going to leave eventually? What's the plan? Katie spoke up for the first time in days. I don't want to go back, she said quietly. Whatever we decide to do, I don't want to go back to that house. None of us wants to go back, Sarah said gently. But Emma's right, we need to figure out what comes next. Marcus set down his knife and looked at each of them in turn. I want you to know that you're free to make whatever choices you want. I didn't bring you up here to trap you. I brought you here to give you options. What kind of options? Emma asked. Well, you could stay here if you want to. I meant what I said about being able to provide for all 3 of you. Or if you want to leave, I could help you get to another town. Maybe help you start new lives somewhere your father couldn't find you. Sarah frowned. You would do that? Help us leave. Marcus nodded. If that's what you wanted, yes. The 3 women exchanged glances. It was clear they had been discussing this among themselves. "What if we wanted to stay, but not as your wives?" Emma asked. "What if we just wanted to live here as friends, partners, people who help each other survive?" Marcus considered this. "I think that could work." "But what about father?" Katie asked. "He's expecting us to be married to you. What happens when he finds out we're not?" This was the question Marcus had been dreading. He knew that Frank Garrison wasn't the type of man to simply forget about his daughters, and sooner or later he would come checking on their arrangement. "We'll deal with that when it happens," he said. "For now, let's focus on making this work." As winter approached, their little community began to find its rhythm. Sarah took charge of managing their household, using her talent with numbers to track their supplies and plan for the long months ahead. Emma continued her education about wilderness survival, becoming skilled enough to help Marcus with hunting and foraging. Katie discovered a talent for crafts, learning to make warm clothes and useful items from the materials around them. Most importantly, they began to trust each other. The fear and desperation that had marked their first days in the cabin gradually gave way to something that felt like friendship and then like family. It was on a cold December morning that Frank Garrison finally came calling. Marcus was out checking his trap lines when he heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. He made his way back quickly, arriving to find Frank and two of his men standing in front of the cabin, while Sarah, Emma, and Katie watched from the doorway. "Well, well," Frank said when he saw Marcus approaching. "The happy husband returns. I thought I'd come check on my daughters, see how married life was treating them." Marcus positioned himself between Frank and the women. "They're doing well, are they?" Frank's eyes glittered with suspicion. "Because I've been hearing some interesting stories in town. Stories about the mountain man who took all 3 Garrison daughters as wives but isn't actually married to any of them." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. Someone had been talking. "Is it true, girls?" Frank called out to his daughters. "Are you actually married to this man, or have you all been playing me for a fool?" The silence stretched out like a held breath. Marcus knew that whatever happened next would determine all of their fates. Frank's men had their hands on their weapons, and Marcus could see the calculation in Frank's eyes as he tried to decide whether to be angry or impressed. Finally, Emma stepped forward. "We're not legally married to Marcus," she said clearly, "but we are bound to him, and he to us, in ways that matter more than any piece of paper." Frank's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" Sarah joined her sister. "Marcus saved us, Father, from you, from the life you had planned for us, from everything we were afraid of becoming. We choose to be here with him." Katie, the quietest of the 3, surprised everyone by speaking up last. "For the first time in our lives, we're happy. We're free. We're building something good together." Frank looked at his daughters for a long moment, and Marcus could see him weighing his options. He could try to force them to return with him, but they were clearly determined to resist. He could try to have Marcus killed, but that would mean dealing with 3 angry daughters who would never forgive him. Or he could accept that his plan had worked out differently than he had expected, but had still accomplished what he claimed to want. His daughters were provided for and protected. "You know," Frank said finally, "I always said I wanted my daughters to marry men who could take care of them. I never specified that they had to marry them one at a time." Marcus felt a surge of relief so strong it almost knocked him over. "But," Frank continued, his voice taking on its familiar threatening tone, "if I ever hear that any of my daughters are being mistreated, if any of them are ever unhappy or unsafe, I'll be back, and next time, I won't be nearly so understanding. Are we clear?" Marcus nodded. Crystal clear. Frank mounted his horse and looked down at the 4 of them standing together in front of the cabin. "Take care of each other," he said. And for the first time since Marcus had met him, his voice carried what sounded like genuine emotion. As Frank and his men disappeared down the mountain trail, the 4 of them stood in silence for a moment. "So," Emma said finally, "I guess we're really doing this." Marcus looked at the 3 women who had become his family through circumstances none of them had chosen, but all of them had embraced. Sarah with her practical wisdom, Emma with her fierce intelligence, Katie with her quiet strength. They had all found something in this mountain cabin that they had never had in Frank Garrison's mansion: the freedom to choose their own path. "Yes," he said, putting his arms around all 3 of them, "I guess we are." Years later, when people in the valley below would talk about the mountain man who lived with the 3 Garrison sisters, they would tell different versions of the story. Some said he had married all 3 of them in a secret ceremony. Others claimed they were just business partners who had found a way to survive together in the harsh mountain wilderness. A few insisted that it was the greatest love story ever told in their part of the country. Marcus never corrected any of these stories. The truth was that what they had built together was more complex and more beautiful than any simple label could capture. They were partners, family, friends, and something entirely new that didn't have a name yet. And every morning when he woke up in the cabin, they had expanded together, surrounded by the people who had chosen to share their lives with him, just as he had chosen to share his life with them. Marcus knew that Frank Garrison's ultimatum had given him something he never could have found on his own, a home that was truly worth fighting for.